All right, everyone. So today I wanted to talk about the best gear stat combos in Raid Shadow Legends, and this list is going to be in priority, which means the first thing that I'm going to talk about is going to be better than the things that we go through later on in the list. And the first gear stat combo is, in my opinion, easily going to be the best 3 stats that you are ever going to look for on any gear in Raid Shadow Legends. And I personally like to call this the trifecta because I used to play a game called Diablo. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with it, but just like in Raid Shadow Legends and Diablo, there are certain stats that triumph others. And we have a combination of 3 stats that if you ever end up finding this on your gear, you're absolutely going to want to keep it and probably put it on a champion that you use very frequently right away, and that is going to be your speed, your crit chance, and your crit damage. Almost every champion in the game is going to get a tremendous amount of benefit from having this combination of stats on your gear. The only exceptions that I can really think of are extremely defensive-based champions where they really don't offer any kind of DPS to the table. And again, this is going to be the exception. Almost every other champion, this is going to be the best combination to find on your gear. Now, these are going to be your substats technically, but you guys will find out as we get a little bit further into the list why, even though these are going to be substats, they directly tie in with what you're looking for out of the main stats on your gear as well. So speed, crit chance, and crit damage. Now, I've been playing the game since April, and even though I've been playing for a long time, it's still very rare to end up finding gear that has this combination of stats. There's just so many other stats and a lot of really bad stats that it's very rare to find gear like this. But I'll just show you guys an example here. If we go, I know I got a couple of shields recently that are Frost that actually have this combination here, and I believe it's the 6-star one right here. There we go. We have crit damage, crit rate, and speed, and then I think I have a 5-star one. I know I have at least a few more, but what I'm trying to say is it's very rare, and if you do ever come across this combination of stats on gear, it's definitely going to be a keeper. Another really good thing about this combination of stats is if you end up finding this on gear, especially if you find it on epic or legendary gear, it's really good because it doesn't really matter what your bonus rolls are going to be. Sure, I might have a little bit of a priority, like I probably still want speed over crit rate, but it's not that big of a deal if it lands on one versus the other. There's no substat on this piece of gear that would ruin it like there would be on another piece of gear, because all 3 of them are insanely good, and that means that I'm going to get an extreme amount of benefit from leveling up my gear as well, because I'm going to get those bonus rolls on all good stats. Now, the downside to legendaries, though, is when you introduce a 4th stat, yes, it might make it easier for you to find crit rate, crit damage, and speed on gear that has 4 options instead of 3, but now if you end up having a bad stat, when you roll up your gear to +4, +8, +12, etc., you have a chance of landing on that bad stat and making your gear not as good. So there's a trade-off. It gets a bit complicated. I'm not going to get too much into that in the video today, but whenever you find speed, crit rate, and crit damage, absolutely keep it, level it up, and put it on a champion that you use frequently. Now let's move on to the next combination of stats, and that is going to be your speed, crit chance, and then the 3rd stat is going to be a percentage stat, and it's going to be either defense, HP, or attack, depending on what your champion scales off of for DPS. And I did put it in priority when it comes to defense, HP, and attack, because generally speaking, the defensive stats are, of course, going to be better than offense, because not only are you building up your champion to do more damage because it's going to scale off of defense, but you're also building up your defenses as well, whereas your attack-based champions are going to end up being very, very squishy. So defense is generally regarded as better than HP, and HP is generally regarded as much better than attack, but whatever your champion uses to scale, that's going to be that percentage-based stat. So, for example, Sir Nicholas scales off of HP, so I would look for percent HP. You know, if I was working on Seeker, because he scales off of defense, I would look for percent defense. And then, you know, if it was another champion that scales, its abilities end up scaling off of attack, and you always want to look at the actual skill itself and not just the champion menu, because the skill is going to tell you each skill might be a bit different, so definitely pay attention to that. damage based on attack, so this champion would be percentage attack when it comes to its priority on gear. So as you can see, we don't have crit damage on this list anymore, and that is going to actually transition us into the third combination, which is going to be speed, crit damage, and then percent defense, HP, or attack. Now, some people might be wondering, especially those of you guys who are mid-game or late-game players, why is crit chance a higher priority than crit damage when it comes to these stat combos? Remember what I said at the start of the video, that this list is going to be in priority. So that first combination, speed, crit chance, and crit damage, is going to be generally regarded by almost everyone as the best. It's going to be better than your speed, crit chance, and then your percent defense, HP, or attack. And then your speed, crit chance, percent defense, HP, or attack is generally going to be regarded as a bit better than your speed, crit damage, and percent defense, HP, and attack. Well, there's actually a very important reason, and this has to do with what I talked about earlier when it comes to the main stats on your gear, and that has to do with your gloves. Now, for a early game player, you're probably still going to use crit chance gloves, I would say. And when it comes to the stats that you can end up getting on gloves, you can always take a look at this just in any menu here. If you go and click on the gloves icon, you can see all the different main stats that you can end up getting on gloves. The two very important ones, though, for mid and late game players especially, are going to be crit rate and crit damage. Now, if you are somebody who does not have a lot of crit rate on your gear and you're still in the earlier phases of gearing out your champions, then you're going to probably want to use crit rate gloves to try to get yourself to 100%. If you are in the later stages of gearing, then you're probably going to actually get all the crit rate that you need without having to use crit rate gloves, and then you're going to be able to use crit damage gloves to boost that up quite a bit. So one of the end game, I guess you could say mid to end game gearing goals of your champions is to eventually transition from being able to use crit rate gloves to crit damage gloves. And as you can see, you get a bit more benefit, up from 50% on 5-star crit rate to 65% crit damage on 5-star crit damage gloves. So you want to eventually end up making that switch, which is why you'll get to a point where you want to try to prioritize your crit chance over your crit damage, so that you end up having enough crit chance to be able to use those crit damage gloves. Now, you never really need to ever go above 100% crit chance. Of course, there's a couple exceptions like the affinity weakness system, but generally speaking, you don't really need to worry about it, so don't go too crazy and overcap your crit chance. Just be aware that for the mid and late game gearing, you're generally going to want to prioritize crit chance over crit damage because of that. But the third stat combo is going to be exactly the same. Notice as well that in all of these gear stat combos, speed has been among them, and that is just because speed is going to be the king of all stats. A lot of endgame players, they don't even look at gear anymore unless it has speed on it. They just instantly throw it away, regardless of what other stats. It could be really good 6-star gear, epic, godly stats, but if it doesn't have speed on it, it's just not even worth it for some of the most endgame players. So you have speed, crit damage, and then once again, percentage defense, HP, or attack, depending on what your champion is going to scale off of. Now, we move into the fourth stat combo, and this is actually going to be the first one that doesn't have speed on it. Now, some players, especially endgame players, might have mixed opinions about this, considering that this combination of 3 stats does not have speed in it, but it's still going to be extremely, extremely good nonetheless. And that is going to be your crit chance, your crit damage, and then your percent defense, HP, or attack, of course, depending on what that champion is going to use to scale. Notice as well how crit chance and crit damage are always going to take priority over your percentage-based stats, and that is because crit chance and crit damage are just overall going to be much better towards your DPS contributions than your percentage-based scaling stats. They are still all important though, and you're going to want to find a healthy balance between everything. You're never going to get perfect gear in Raid Shadow Legends, so you really don't need to worry too much about that. So this is going to be the fourth combination of stats on the list. It doesn't have speed on it, but still, with crit chance, crit damage, and then percent defense, HP, and attack, with that combination of 3 stats on a piece of gear, you're definitely not going to want to throw it away. You're still going to want to level it up and use it on a champion that you use frequently. So a couple of notes as well. Out of these gear stat combos, all of them except for the last one had speed on it, and that's quite simply because speed is going to be the king of all stats. Again, generally crit chance over crit damage, because with enough crit chance, you can equip crit damage gloves, which I talked about a bit earlier. That's going to be one of your end game gearing goals, I guess you could say. And then crit chance and crit damage are going to be more important than your percentage-based stats like defense, HP, attack, because they just overall scale better and will contribute more towards your overall champion's DPS. Now, one thing I didn't really talk about are all the other stats, and this list was just the combinations of the best 3 stats to find on your gear. There's still a ton of other stats, and a lot of the gear that you end up coming across is probably not going to have these gear stat combos on them because they are quite rare. Accuracy is still very, very good on champions that need accuracy, but speed, crit chance, and crit damage plus your percentage-based stats are always still going to be a priority. Even though it's important, I would never prioritize going for accuracy over going for one of those DPS-focused stats instead, or of course, speed. So you should be able to eventually, with just random stats that you end up getting on gear without having to worry too much about it, and through your Great Hall as well. As you play the game more, you'll be able to work on your Great Hall, and also through your banner, you should, with that combination, be able to get enough accuracy on most champions without having to sacrifice things like speed, crit chance, crit damage, percent, HP, defense, attack, those things in order to end up getting it. So don't really need to worry too much about that. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on in this video is something I didn't talk about at all, and that is flat stats. Now, there's a lot of other not super great stats that are not going to take priority. Of course, you have your flat HP, flat attack, flat defense, resistance, as well as another one I didn't really talk about, and those stats are never going to really be a priority in comparison to the gear stat combos that I talked about in this video. The absolute only exception really is for extremely defensive-based champions that don't really contribute any kind of DPS to your team at all. If you don't need crit rate for anything, if they don't do any kind of damage, if their entire goal and role in your team is to do something besides damage, like they're a support champion, then you can actually end up working with flat-based stats to increase their defenses even more. And it actually turns out that the flat-based stats in that situation are not as bad as you might think they are. If you have a champion that doesn't really do any kind of damage, then you don't really need a bunch of crit rate, crit chance, because they're not doing any damage anyway. You might as well make them more survivable, make them live longer, and then you'll be able to get more benefit on your team from all the buffs and support that they provide. Just an example off the top of my head, I guess even a free-to-play example is going to be a champion like Spirit Host. You know, Spirit Host, sure, she does have an auto attack that does a little bit of damage, attacks one enemy, heals by 50% of the damage inflicted, but the overall goal of this champion is not going to be her DPS. It's going to be her support. She has this buff right here, places a 50% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns, and also her debuff cleanser removes all debuffs on all allies, places a block debuff buff on all allies for 1 turn, and of course her speed aura. The main priority of Spirit Host is not damage. Even if you got a bunch of crit rate, a bunch of crit damage, it's still more important to make this champion live longer so you can get more benefit from her 2nd and her 3rd skill than to build her up just based off of her small amount of damage you're going to get from the auto attack. So with that all being said, this is a bit more of a, I guess you could say, mid-game video. Those of you guys who are newer, I hope you're still able to follow along, and this was just a list and priority of some of the best gear stat combos in Raid Shadow Legends. If you guys enjoyed this video, you want more videos like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to toss a quick like as well, and more Raid Shadow Legends videos should be popping up on the screen right about now, so feel free to check them out. But if not, until next time, have a great day, everyone. Take care, and this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.